Tonight we're live from Western Sydney, where people have been battered by COVID, floods and skyrocketing costs of living. So what do they think of Scott Morrison's secret grab for power? How can they trust our political leaders? Welcome to Q&A. Hello, I'm Stan Grant and we are at the Jones Sutherland Performing Arts Centre in Penrith tonight for that lovely Penrith welcome. Thank you. On the panel with me is best-selling author of Stolen Focus, Why You Can't Pay Attention, Johann Hari. Former New South Wales Liberal member Catherine Cusack, Minister for Emergency Management and Agriculture Murray Watt. Archibald Prize-winning artist and musician Blak Douglas. Founding Director of Western Sydney Women, Amanda Rose, and from Bundaberg, former Resources Minister, or should that be Co-Minister? Keith Pitt. Sorry for that, Keith. It's great to have you all here. Stick around as well, because we're going to bring you a performance later from local poet Uncle Wes Marne. You do not want to miss that. Remember, you can stream us on iView, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. Quanda is the hashtag. Please get involved. And we're in an area that's been heavily impacted by multiple flood events. We're going to get to your questions on that as well a little later. Our first question, though, comes from Shari Driver. Shari?
What Scott Morrison did, with all the secrecy around his actions, just fell short of absolutism. A Napoleon who proclaimed himself emperor. What measures is the government going to take to prevent such an abuse of power?
Murray Watt.
I guess that comes to someone in the government first,
doesn't it?
Indeed. Yeah. Well, I think like all Australians, I was just shocked when I heard about this news. It's something that's never happened in Australian history, and I don't think it's something that we ever thought would happen in our own country.
The question, though, was...
what will we do?
What are you going to do?
Well, we're obviously in the process at the moment of getting advice from the Solicitor General, the highest lawyer in the land, who represents the government, about what kind of measures can be put in place to ensure that this kind of thing can never happen again. It was never intended to. You know, that's why we have the Constitution. That's why we have all sorts of legislation to protect democracy and protect our system of government. And unfortunately, it seems that the former Prime Minister just rode roughshod over that. And I think it really undermines trust in our system, which is already pretty low. And I think it's a really disgraceful way for the former Prime Minister to have conducted himself.
We are going to come to Keith Pitt in just a moment, but I want to go around the table. Amanda, as someone living in Western Sydney, what have people been saying to you? What have you picked up this week in reaction to this?
How long have you got?
We don't have a whole show. Yeah. Well, we've got a show to talk about this, but not the entire
let's
show.
face it, Western Sydney usually ignored until it's election time, and then all of a sudden they're given all these promises, and most often they're not adhered to. This particular issue, what it has done is not just that the ex-Prime Minister has done this, it now questions every single thing every politician does. Now we're thinking, is that person telling the truth? What is that person up to? So, you know, I did a poll for Western Sydney women, 96% of people don't trust politicians. That is staggering. That is huge. And I don't blame them, to be honest, because of situations like this. But now everything's going to be questioned. So when something is promised or someone announces something, it sounds great, or what are you really up to, what's going on? So I think it's more than just fixing that one issue. I think it's something about transparency throughout the whole government. Let's
do our own poll. Hands up who feels, like Amanda says, that there's a loss of trust, or you've been gobsmacked by what you've seen. Hands up. I should have asked for those who weren't. I think it's unanimous. Johann, you know, you've lived through the UK and you've seen Boris Johnson, and we've all watched that from afar. What have you made of this week here?
Well, Scott Morrison seems to me a bit like herpes. Just when you think it's gone away, it comes back worse than ever.
I wasn't expecting to go there so quickly.
You know, And as you can tell from my accent, I am an outsider here. I am from Downton Abbey, and I've been
Upstairs or downstairs?
Scott Morrison. Sadly, definitely downstairs. But I've been thinking about Scott Morrison a lot in relation to 3 other leaders, right? So you mentioned Boris Johnson, a person who felt the rules didn't apply to him, to the point that he locked down the country and had parties where they sent out invites saying, bring your own booze. I thought about Donald Trump. I live half the time in the US. A man who thought the rules didn't apply to him, to the point that when he stopped being president, he took classified nuclear secrets out of the White House, and this week, in the past week, the FBI had to raid Mar-a-Lago to get them back. But the person I thought most about, actually, was Angela Merkel. So at the height of COVID, Angela Merkel addressed the German people, and she said to them, the last thing you want to do as a German chancellor with our history is suspend anyone's democratic freedoms. So I am going to be 100% transparent with you every step of the way about what I'm doing and how to stop you. There's a line she said that I thought about so much in relation to Morrison. She said, this is what democracy means. We make political decisions transparent and we explain them. Australians deserve more Merkel and less Morrison, in my view.
Well
Well, on that question of accountability, it does lead to our next question from Kathy Moffat.
My question is for Keith Pitt. I'm an old netballer, taught to play hard and fair. How does it sit with you to play on a team with Scott Morrison when he wants to be the captain, coach and manager and play himself in every position on the court? Does Mr Morrison need to be sat on the sidelines by the umpire until he learns his place and to play by the rules?
There you go, Keith.
Well, I was a netball dad for a while. My girls are getting a bit older now and they haven't continued with any of that. But even to your previous question, I mean, there's been talks about a Royal Commission and investigation and inquiry, and I'm quite supportive of that, as long as it includes all levels of government. Because there were some strange decisions at a state level as well, whether that's Premier Palaszczuk stopping people from accessing a hospital because they're on the wrong side of the line, massive lockdowns in Victoria, with a whole heap of really challenging positions. But in terms of our government, the previous government, I'm very comfortable with the decisions that I made, 100% rock solid.
Can I just ask though,
important
Keith,
to make that point.
Can I just ask though, Keith, there is a timeline here, and I want to try to get this clear now, that you knew in 2021, yes?
It's somewhere in 2021. Okay. I'm working through the details.
So you were aware that Scott Morrison had also sworn himself into your portfolio. He'd made a decision, effectively overruling a position that you wanted to take on an offshore project, a gas project.
Well, they're your words, not mine. This is obviously a case that's before appeal in the court right now, so I can't make any specific comment.
He had made that decision. I assume he was making that decision not just as Prime Minister, but also as your co-minister.
Well, he issued a statement in February where he stated that he'd made a decision under the Offshore Petroleum and Gas Act, and that was pretty clear and pretty public. So whether I'm uncomfortable, unhappy, it doesn't really matter. That doesn't affect the operation of the government or how decisions are made. It's about ensuring that we are making the right decisions, and they are in accordance with all of the requirements.
So at some time in 2021 you knew. We're all discovering now this week the extent of this. Why didn't you tell others in your own party, the Nationals, in the coalition as well?
Well, you're making some assumptions there, mate, I've got to say. I did raise it with the leader.
You knew in 2021, so you alerted people, did you, that Scott Morrison had secretly sworn himself into your portfolio?
I had a discussion with Michael McCormack as leader of the Nationals, as you would expect I would. I had a particular view, but Michael was the leader. He was responsible for the agreement between
what did he say?
Our two parties.
What did he say? That the Prime Minister had sworn himself into your portfolio as well? Presumably the Prime Minister then, Scott Morrison, had not told Michael McCormack. Was that news to him?
Well, look, in terms of a very specific issue, we had a number of discussions over a long period of time. If we look in general terms at PEP 11, that's an exploration permit that's been around since 1999. It's nothing new.
Sorry,
20 years.
I'm just trying, just for people in the audience, trying to just get clarity around this, because so much of the questioning has been around secrecy. You told Michael McCormack, Scott Morrison has sworn himself into my portfolio. Is that what you told your then leader?
Well, if I recall correctly, I think Michael may well have been at one of those meetings. But as I've said,
no, sorry,
I'm working my way.
I just don't understand what you're saying here, Keith. You were aware that Scott Morrison, sometime in 2021, you became aware that Scott Morrison had sworn himself into your portfolio. The public didn't know this, by the way. And you told Michael McCormack, hey, Scott Morrison has now sworn himself in to my portfolio as effectively co-minister. You told Michael McCormack, the leader of your party, then Deputy Prime Minister, that explicitly.
Well, I'll answer the question if that's okay. It may have occurred in a meeting that Michael was at with all of us, including the PM and his representatives, or it may have been a separate discussion. I'm working my way through what is a very complex diary, as you can imagine. But we certainly had that discussion. Michael was certainly aware.
It just doesn't... Does this make sense to you? I'm sorry, Keith. I know you're here from the government and you are the only one. Thank you for turning up and taking these questions. But so much of this is revolved around secrecy, and I just can't even get an answer from you that makes sense on this. Now you're saying Michael McCormack may have been in the room, you may have said that, the Prime Minister may have. Did you tell your leader, Michael McCormack, Deputy Prime Minister, that the Prime Minister had sworn himself in secretly to your portfolio? Yes? No?
Well, mate, I'll use my own words if that's all right.
Yeah,
we had a discussion. Michael was aware, but my recollection was that he may well have been in the room when we had a previous discussion with the PM. But as I've said, okay, I'm working my way through that because I want to be absolutely certain that I've got the timeline right, and this is a serious issue which is before the courts. So you can understand that I'm being very cautious to make sure I get it right.
PEP 11, that decision is brought before the courts. The Scott Morrison issue and swearing himself into your portfolio and multiple portfolios is not yet. Just a final thing, and then I want to come to Kathy here, who's on the panel as well. I just want to be clear here as well. Bridget McKenzie, one of your colleagues, has said that what Scott Morrison did is a breach of the coalition agreement. You're a National. Do you agree with that, that swearing himself in secretly to your portfolio was a breach of that agreement?
Well, 2 points. That agreement is made between the leader of both parties and its contents are between them. And it is an allocation of portfolios based on a proportion. But in terms of things being secret, I mean, the PM made a very clear statement in February in regards to the decision on PEP 11, where he stated outright that he'd taken a decision under that particular act.
It's not the portfolio. Kathy, what do you make of all this? And you've walked away from the Liberal Party in New South Wales just last week, but what do you make of what we've seen?
Well, I mean, this is the sort of behaviour that has basically made me feel forced out of politics, because it is not the behaviour of normal people, and it's certainly not... Sorry, Keith, but...
I'm just an electrician, mate, former farmer.
I understand,
doing my best.
But we all know how teams work, and this is definitely, the captain... being the bowler, the batsman, the wicket-keeper and taking all the catches in slips is not feasible, and it's not how teams operate, and it leaves everyone else on the team feeling pretty unhappy, I would have thought, about the game. So, I find it scheming. Of course, everyone wants to know why would he do that. It suggests, he had some... wanted to have something up his sleeve when he's dealing with his colleagues. So what does that do to trust inside the team? And I would also add, because it was the pandemic, the obligation to be transparent wasn't less, it was so much higher because Parliament wasn't sitting. And everyone had agreed to give him these powers. The obligation on him for disclosure was as high as it could ever be.
Can I go back to Kathy, the old netballer? I'm sorry to use the word old. You said an old netballer. You said, should the Prime Minister be sat down? What do you mean by that? Do you think he should have to leave the Parliament?
Maybe he should start to play an individual sport where if he wins, loses or it's a draw, he's only got himself to blame, Stan.
Murray Watt, it does raise the question, should the Prime Minister... the former Prime Minister remain in the Parliament? I haven't heard anyone on your side. There have been some on the other side who've said yes, that he should now step down from his seat Do you believe you should?
Well, I mean, ultimately it's a matter for the Liberal Party, but my personal view is he should go. And frankly, there's someone else there's someone else on this panel here tonight who was in on this as well and knew about it. This is an extraordinary revelation tonight on the show that the Deputy Prime Minister of the country was in on this as well, apparently. I don't know whether there were other members of the National Party who knew about it. And this point about the coalition agreement is another problem here. It is a secret agreement. We were calling for years when we were in opposition for the coalition agreement to be revealed. So we've got a secret agreement between the Liberals and the Nationals that is now breached by a secret appointment of a Prime Minister that the Deputy Prime Minister knows about. I mean, I don't know how Keith and Michael McCormack justified that to their National Party colleagues, that they've reneged on an agreement that's supposed to be giving them as a party and therefore country people more of a say.
Well, Keith's had a chance to answer some of those, but Blak Douglas, what do you make of it all?
Well, your conversation there is like throwing a right-handed boomerang with your left hand in the wrong wind direction. It's going nowhere. And I think we're all tired of it. You need to talk straight, you fellas, you know. And certainly Scott Morrison's no Michael Jordan. Let's put it that way. He couldn't run the whole show, but that's all. I think we're really asking for that transparency and who's going to step up to the plate and actually offer that to the people.
And can we not use taxpayers' funds to find out what happened? So every time there's an issue, so I think if someone has done something wrong, they should fund it themselves. It should be garnished from their wages or back pay, because it is a Royal Commission or something. It's our money. We need shelters with that money.
Can I ask Murray as well, what about the Governor-General? I mean, Anthony Albanese, your leader and Prime Minister now, has excused the Governor-General. Scott Morrison says it's not to blame the Governor-General, but isn't there some responsibility here? He's head of state.
Look, it's certainly an odd situation for the Governor-General to have found himself in, but I don't think that we should be absolving Scott Morrison ultimately of his responsibility here.
The Governor-General is the head of state. He'd be the last line of defence. And if he knew something was up, if he thought this was happening in secret, and he was certainly aware as the portfolios mounted, why didn't he do more?
Well, look, I suppose I can only go on the basis of his comments, which is that his role is to act on the advice of the government, and the advice of the government through the Prime Minister was to do this. I mean, just to briefly return to the point about Scott Morrison's future, this is also now a test for Peter Dutton's leadership of the Liberal Party. He's tried to do the old, let's move on, nothing to see here, it's all fine, let's talk about something else. If Peter Dutton is serious about restoring integrity to politics, then he's got a job to do about managing Scott Morrison.
Scott Morrison's defence at the press conference, I really recommend you all watch it. It's an hour of my life I'll never get back. You should suffer too. But it was so fascinating. His defence was, the whole opening is, so I was really good in COVID. You'd all be dead if it wasn't for me. What are you whinging about? And I thought this is a really peculiar response to what he's been accused of. It's deeply weird.
The ends don't justify the means.
Yeah,
I want to move on to our next question, but before we go, Keith Pitt, what do you think Scott Morrison's future should be now that we've had even people on your side calling for him to step down from the Parliament?
Well, Murray's got his talking points up, so he's right. But he's elected by the people of Cook, as I am by the people of Hinkler. I mean, this is how our constitution works. This is how you're elected to the Parliament. It's entirely a decision for Scott and the people that he represents. I'll be doing my best as a member of the opposition. It's not a position that any of us want to be in, as Murray would know. I'm sure he's very pleased to be part of the government. But fundamentally, I stand by the decisions we made throughout the COVID pandemic. They were the right decisions based on the information we had at the time. And as I said earlier, I'd welcome an inquiry. I mean, if Murray wants to ring Albo and say, hey, let's go. Sorry, Prime Minister Albanese, well, let's get on with it.
All right, our next question to get on with it comes from Pat Hopper.
Thank you, Stan. I'd like to ask the panel about, or reference that recent report regarding the New South Wales Parliament, and I'd like to know what tangible and real-time steps can be taken to eliminate and punish this insidious behaviour that seems rampant.
You're talking about the Broderick report?
I'm talking about that recent report, yes. And I'd like to know what steps can be taken to eliminate and punish that sort of behaviour and make sure it never happens again. You know?
Thank you, Pat. A reference there to what's being described as boozy, predatory boys' club of New South Wales Parliament. Kathy, you were there.
Absolutely. I think it's a devastating report. It paints a toxic political culture, which is causing really good people to leave, many people being damaged, and the Parliament is not functioning effectively on behalf of the public that it's elected to serve.
You took this decision last week, right, to leave the party. You're not going to be involved anymore. But this was going on for a long time. Why only last week? What were you thinking?
Oh, for sure. What happens in these workplace cultures, and I would say, first of all, to me, it's deteriorated very significantly, really, in the last 8 to 10 years. It was certainly not like this when I entered Parliament in 2003. And I think the nature of the parties and the factions has become very ruthless and brutal. And you see now the likes of Scott and the way he does politics, that has terrible implications for people in the workplace. But look, if I can just make this suggestion to answer the question, that there are workplace safety rules and laws in New South Wales that apply in every workplace except Parliament House.
Wow.
And the reason is that the members are elected, as we've been talking earlier with Scott, and so the MPs can't be disciplined and controlled in the same way that a normal organisation would do. And the MPs, therefore, need to be the ones that come together and say, we will enact those laws for this workplace. And in my opinion, that would be and we do need to have complaints mechanisms for people, because just continuing this secrecy theme that seems to be, shrouding this week, that's been a big problem. And then thirdly, there needs to be a recall provision for MPs so that their constituents do have an opportunity to call for by-elections and actually get rid of them themselves if in those circumstances.
But Murray Watt, there is an ICAC in New South Wales, but your party proposing a federal ICAC. Just to broaden this, the types of things that ICAC can look at in New South Wales will not necessarily be the type of things that can happen at a federal level. For instance, what we've seen with Scott Morrison, is that the sort of thing that a federal ICAC would be able to look into?
I'm not sure that the particular circumstances involving Scott Morrison and the dual appointments would fall within what a federal ICAC would be looking at. We're obviously still in the process of putting that legislation together, but the idea really is to target serious and systemic corruption. And as appalling as that behaviour was, I'm not sure that it would necessarily fall into systemic and serious corruption. But I think it's vital that we have a federal anti-corruption commission. I think it's a critical step towards restoring trust among the public in public life. There have been arguments that some of the state bodies at different times have gone too far, but they've also uncovered some very deep corruption. And frankly, it's sometimes involved people on both sides of politics. So, I think that there have been a lot of questions, especially over the last few years, about slush funds and dodgy grants and rorts and things like that. And I think the sooner we can have that kind of anti-corruption commission in, the better.
Blak Douglas, as someone observing politics, living in Western Sydney, and we've seen, Keith Pitt tonight has been getting questions about his side of politics, but we've seen New South Wales Labor MPs, state level, go to jail. We've seen corruption, we've seen illegality, we've got the Broderick report, we've seen also the report into the type of behaviour in federal parliament as well. What do you make of it all, and what do people say to you about the state of politics?
Well, it's incredibly surreal in the sense that I've been thinking about this behaviour by Scott Morrison's former government, and the fact that we have the highest incarceration rate on the planet per capita, and the rate of locking up First Nations youth is as reprehensible as Scott's behaviour. I mean, black kids in community get locked up for looking sideways at a cop, and yet he can get away with this behaviour. And to boldly state in the press conference that he just didn't tell the Australian public, he just didn't need to tell the Australian public. What kind of leader is that?
Pat, I think you want to ask a follow-up question.
I do, actually. I'd like to touch on the point that Blak Douglas just made, and I thank you for that. It just shows the character of the man. He is nothing but a bully. Yes. And that character that emanates from him and did the whole time he was in power has just flowed through our whole political system. And I think it's pathetic. And I really don't want a situation where we need to have these conversations in 10 years' time. And with the way it's been handled at the moment, I think that's going to happen. I really do. And I'll go back to my original question. What tangible, real-time steps can happen now to stop this crap ever happening again? And we haven't got an answer yet.
And you don't believe you have the answer to that?
No, I mean, there's lots of words, lots of great words everyone's saying tonight, which is good, but, you know, give me a tangible step.
I think your points were quite good, but we also don't remember this is a cultural issue. The fish rots from the head down.
It does.
Right?
Yes.
So it is the leader's responsibility to find out who is responsible for this behaviour. It doesn't need to be made public if that's the case, whatever it is, but get rid of it quickly. It needs to be cut out instantly, not have a discussion, talk about it, let's find a way to get along. There is so much bullying going, and anyone that's dealt with a bully knows.
That's right.
The second that you stand up to one, they will make it their lifelong ambition to destroy you.
Yeah.
So we've got people in Parliament that cannot speak out because they will get destroyed, and they're the ones we want in Parliament.
That's exactly right.
Let's move... As you said at the start of the program, many people here have been directly impacted by the floods, and I want to go to Liz Bradley now for her question specifically about what's happened in the floods. And Liz, you've been directly affected as well.
Yes, Dan.
What happened in your case? Before we go to your question, what happened?
Well, my home and my property was severely damaged and has been damaged 4 times, 4 floods over the last 12-month period.
4 times?
4 floods.
Yeah. And where does that leave you right now? Are you any closer to getting repairs?
Well, each time it floods, the damage is increasingly worse. The last flood was higher than the expected level, and we had a significant amount of damage to our house and our property. But like most residents at the moment in the Hawkesbury, and it's mirrored in the Lismore area as well, we are very hesitant to make decisions to right the damage because of the impending events in the very near future.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that, and there are other people in the room who've been affected as well. What's the question you want to put to the panel?
Thanks, Dan. My question is for Senator Watt. Could you please clarify why alternative protocols are not implemented for the gradual and early release of water from Warragamba Dam, especially during La Niña periods when the BOM has knowledge of impending devastating weather events? Surely the risk assessment should identify early action, as opposed to what we've seen recently, and I'm sorry to use the emotive term, but I believe it's just let them drown, because that's the inaction that we're seeing. The dam is currently at 100% capacity, and there is a significant weather event predicted for September, and now it's going to be compounded by the Indian Ocean dipole. What is the government going to do to support us and save us from further devastation in respect to using proactive protocols for early release of water?
Murray?
Thanks, Liz. And of course, can I join Stan in saying I'm very sorry about what you've had to go through. I'm a Queenslander myself, but I've got to know the Hawkesbury very well over the last couple of years as our Shadow Minister for Disaster Management and now the Minister. And I've met so many people like yourself who have gone through 3 or 4 floods in recent times. Of course, your region was affected by the bushfires as well, and it's had a huge effect on people. The In terms of the level of the dam, I've followed that debate very closely. I'm absolutely not wanting to pass the buck here, so please let me finish. The operation of the dam is obviously a New South Wales government matter rather than a federal government matter.
And Murray, can we just be clear as well, because for people in the room and people watching, just how the legislation shapes that as well, that the dam is not there for flood mitigation but for water storage. So that impacts what exactly can be done. Is that right?
That's my understanding. Again, not being the state minister, it's not directly under my control, but my understanding, as you say, Stan, is that dam was built mainly for water supply rather than flood mitigation, and I suspect that probably has impacted on the way the dam has been operated. And it's very similar to a situation we had in Queensland in 2011 when the Wivenhoe Dam, there were issues about releases there. What I can undertake to you is to speak to the relevant minister in the New South Wales government about those protocols, because you're right, we are facing more floods in the very near future, and we need to make sure that people aren't exposed to that kind of damage. The other thing I might just quickly say, and happy to elaborate if you like, what we are wanting to do as a federal government is significantly increase investment at the federal level in disaster mitigation and flood mitigation. You probably remember when the last government was in, they had a big $4-5 billion fund that was set up to invest in disaster mitigation and recovery and didn't do anything for 3 years. What we've said is that we want to invest every year in flood levies, drainage improvements, bushfires.
Does that mean funding as well, a proposed raising of the dam level?
Well, we're waiting on the New South Wales government to tell us what they want to do about that. They have put forward that as a solution, but equally I've met many people in the Hawkesbury who don't support raising the Warragamba Dam and prefer to see things like reducing the levels of water in the dam.
Yeah.
We've heard the suggestion that the wall needs to be raised for the last 30 years. My concern is not about the possibility of extending the wall or building a new wall. My concern is that we know there's going to be devastation and we know it's going to be ongoing.
And you're looking
as
for
recently as last week, there's a prediction there's 3 more cycles of La Nina. I don't care how fast they build the wall. They won't be able to ever build it fast enough to save us the next time.
So Stan, if I can just add, I think the perception in this community very strongly is that people are playing politics around the damn wall and that the flooding is kind of driving the case to build the wall up, when in actual fact you just need to drop the water level and it'll take 1 metre or 1.5 metres to fight the flood. No one can understand why they don't do that.
Johann, again, as someone coming from the outside, but you've seen these things playing out overseas as well, the impact of climate change, more extreme weather events. When you look at something like this, questions about raising a wall or releasing water in the right way and how people are best protected from these events, what do you draw from overseas experience?
Well, you know, I really feel for Liz, and I've met people all over the world who are being affected by the fact that the climate is being put on steroids, by the fact there's so many heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere. It's causing the Arctic and the Antarctic to melt. It's causing sea levels to rise. And there's bad news and good news about that. The bad news is this is what we're seeing with 1 degree centigrade of global warming. There are a lot of young people in the audience. On the current trajectory, you could live to see 6 degrees centigrade of global warming. So everyone watching, you look at Liz, you look at Penrith, this is one vision of where many of us could be headed. Then there's the good news. The good news is the United States just passed, in fact, I think on global warming, this is literally the most hopeful week of our lifetimes. The United States just passed an enormous climate package that, frankly, I did not believe they could do. I know, Liz, you're going to think, well, that's too far down the road for me, and I 100% understand that, and you're totally right to think that. But this package will cut American carbon emissions by 40% in the next 16 years. It is staggering. An enormous investment in the transition to renewable energy. That is going to save a lot of people. That should be energising everyone in Australia. The world did notice that your election turned in part on global warming. That was hugely encouraging. The world did also notice your country, you know, burned down in 2019. We remember the horrendous Black Summer. People are seeing what's happening here. So I think all of us, there is a movement towards something positive. It's nowhere near fast enough, but you should be at the absolute... I know you're just struggling to keep your head above water, literally, but at the absolute forefront of the fight to reduce the number of heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere, we should all be talking about you and thinking about you.
Stan, can I just step in for a moment?
Yeah.
As a adopt a Darug representative here and just remind people that I'm glad you said it's not about raising the wall, because raising the wall, as we've come to know, poses significant threats to some important Darug sites in the area.
Yes.
And of course, we're on Darug land tonight, and we're grateful to be here as well. Liz, thank you so much for your question. Are you back in your house now, by the way?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yes,
and
yes.
things are okay for now, but you're worried about the rain to come?
Yeah, I won't be repairing it in any time soon.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Good luck. Our next question comes from Nadine Saab.
Hi.
Hey, Nadine.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
That's good.
How are you?
Yeah, not bad, thanks. Okay, so my question is, will there be government buybacks of our land, like with the Lismore residents? If so, how much is the value determined? Is compensation provided? I don't drive, and I've had to rely on my family and friends and public transport. I did work for the local council, but I lost my job because I couldn't let them know when I'd be back to work. I've lost 2 ponies and one of my beloved Jack Russells due to the incompetency of our government, and I've had to provide everything but my firstborn child in order to receive funds to fix the damage caused by them. And do they actually realise what's involved in cleaning up the mess that they've caused?
Murray, what can you do in terms of buyback? Because we know that that's been one of the issues that's emerged out of the Lismore inquiry as well. There's been some criticism about that and more detail needed. What can you do?
There's certainly, and again, I'm sorry that you've had to go through this so many times. There certainly have been other occasions when governments have funded those kind of buybacks, and I've seen in this report...
Queensland?
In Queensland in particular, after the 2011 floods that wiped out southeast Queensland, the example that's always pointed to is a little town called Grantham in the Lockyer Valley, west of Queensland, west of Brisbane. I was actually just passing through that region the other day, and there were about 100 homes, I think it was, that were bought back, and families were relocated to higher ground in that town. And there were some people, though, who chose not to move. The floods that happened there earlier this year, all of the people who were relocated to higher ground weren't flooded. The people who didn't move and were still where they were flooded again. So that shows you that there can be some really positive outcomes from those kind of relocations. They're not cheap, they're big dollars, but we pay big dollars every time we have to go in and help people recover. So again, the report was only released yesterday by the New South Wales government.
You're ready to stump up money?
Well, obviously I've got to go through some processes. I can't just sign a cheque for that right here and now.
Have you been asked?
No, so we haven't yet received a formal request from the New South Wales government for that, but there's obviously been lots of talk about that in the media, so I'm expecting them to come and have a chat to us about that pretty soon.
We did ask Premier Perrottet to appear tonight. I think we're still waiting for the response, but he's not here. But just to be clear on this, you have supported in Queensland, right? So about half of the cost in Queensland?
Yeah, so you might remember just before the election there was a pretty unseemly fight about getting Queensland funding for those sort of buybacks, and the Queensland government is now pretty well advanced in a buyback program for southeast Queensland. I think there's been about 4,000 odd people who've applied for funding. Some of them want to relocate and want buybacks. Some of them simply want money to lift their homes and do other things, and that has been jointly funded between the state and federal government, and if the New South Wales government want to make a similar request, we'd be happy to talk to them.
Keith Pitt, you're in Queensland. Is there something that New South Wales could learn from the Queensland experience?
Oh, look, you always get better at these things, and unfortunately they happen a lot. I've got a lot of sympathy for everyone that's watching and that's there in the crowd. I mean, we had a similar issue in 2013, a very major flood here in Bundaberg. But I think what's been put out by New South Wales this week, the biggest challenge is there's just not enough detail. People need certainty. They need to be able to make decisions about whether they repair their home, whether they give up and move, whether they do something else. And what's been released is just not good enough. I mean, to be that frank, it's just not good enough. You've got thousands of people out there who are either camping at their homes because they don't know whether to repair it or not. And after this period of time, they've come out with, well, we think we might buy some things back. Now, I know Murray's heart's in the right place, and I hope they get on with it as quickly as possible, but you've just got to give people the opportunity to make decisions.
Blak Douglas, you've got connections to Lismore, that's right as well? When you look at what's happened there and talking to people up there and look at the report and the response, where there's been some criticism precisely to what Keith talked about, a lack of detail and people still waiting to see exactly when they'll get the buyback. What are your thoughts on this and the response to it and how people are responding in Lismore?
We were just discussing back backstage there about the fact that I'm quite confident that the Labor government would have rolled things out quickly or more, in a quicker pace. Either way, at the end of the day, the people are in dire circumstances up there, and many people are waiting for some glimpse of hope as to what is going to be implemented. And people are camping in their lounge rooms up there, basically paying mortgages on houses that are worth next to nothing. And so we need to really step up to the plate and act on what can be done.
Nadine.
For the past year, I've been repairing my house and my property, and just through doing research, I've just only realised, just found out that my front yard, my home, my land has been rezoned. So my front yard has been rezoned for the Denmark Road, Link Road, and my backyard's been rezoned for a sporting complex. I can't do anything with my property at the moment because they've put a caveat on it. So am I supposed to fix it, then in September it gets flooded again, and then keep fixing it until they come and say, hey, we want your land?
Yeah, unfortunately, Nadine, no one here can give you that answer. But talk to our producers after the program. We'll maybe try to. But
it's a classic example of the everyday person being absolutely screwed over, right? Because they don't know what's going on. No one tells them what's going on. And even in that flood report, the one thing that really stood out to me is they actually acknowledged the power of the community, and it was the community that got people through, and how they need to actually give them the resources and the machinery and everything they need, because it was the community that kept those people alive and kept those people hopeful.
Come back to us on that. Come back to us on that detail, Nadine, as well. Sure. We'll see if we can follow that up for you. And our next question comes from Neil Fonseca. Neil?
My question is to Johann.
Hi.
Hi. I watched a program on TEDx regarding depression and anxiety that you spoke of, and we've heard a lot of people here having issues. Not only the floods, but inflation, high interest rates, things like that, and the fires. There is no real national standard for depression really to treat it and to control it by the government. And the marginalized part of society gets more impacted than the rest of the society. What can the governments do to alleviate that problem? And are you aware of better systems in the UK or the US?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and this was very important to me because I had a lot of depression in my teenage years and in my 20s. And so I went on this big journey for my book, Lost Connections, to try to understand. I was very conscious when I started working on that book. Every single year that I've been alive, depression and anxiety had increased in Australia, in Britain, and across the Western world. And I wanted to understand, well, why, right? Why is it that with each year that passes, more and more of us are finding it harder to get through the day? And then obviously in the last 2 years, as everyone knows, for obvious reasons, depression and anxiety doubled, right? In Britain, and I'm sure there was a very similar increase here in Australia. So I wanted to understand why. And it's a complicated question. I learned there's actually scientific evidence for 9 causes of depression and anxiety. But I think something that connects a lot of them, not all of them. So everyone here knows you've got natural physical needs, right? You need food, you need water, you need shelter, you need clean air. If I took those things away from you, you'd all be in real trouble real fast. But there's equally strong evidence that all human beings have natural psychological needs. You need to feel you belong. You need to feel your life has meaning and purpose. You need to feel that people see you and value you. You need to feel you've got a future that makes sense. I'm thinking about all of you talking about not knowing if you have a future that makes sense, right? So when we think about depression, we've thought about it in a very narrow way. We've thought about it primarily as a biological malfunction. There are definitely biological contributions. Some people are really helped by chemical antidepressants. Anyone in the audience in that position, carry on taking them. But we've got to understand this in a much deeper way. Depression and anxiety did not double in the last 2 years because all of our brains started to spontaneously malfunction. They doubled because we were cut off from each other. We were financially insecure. We were terribly anxious. In this community, I can't imagine how much it went up. So when you ask what the government's got to do, there's loads of things they've got to do. They've got to understand, first of all, and we've all got to understand, depression is not primarily a malfunction. Depression is a signal. it's telling us something. It's telling us that our deeper needs are not being met. We need to stop insulting that signal and start listening to it.
But Johann, you did point out that the chemical response is also important, because you have been criticised by some for saying that you went off medication because you felt as though you were still dealing with depression. But the chemical response is still important.
So to be fair to the people who said that, they admit they haven't read my book. In the book I talk about, that's not what I say.
But that was the criticism.
Yeah, but they haven't read it, and they admitted they hadn't read it, to be totally fair to them. No, I think we need to understand this in a broad... For something as complex as depression, there needs to be a broad menu of options that deal with the underlying causes. Chemical antidepressants, 100% should be one of the things on the menu. They helped me for a while, and then sadly for me, they stopped helping me. But we've got to have a much broader range. Can I give you an example of just one thing? I go through loads in the book, Lost Connections, but I'll give you an example of one. One reason why depression has exploded is because of loneliness, right? We are the loneliest society in human history, even before the lockdowns began.
Even though we're so connected in so many other ways.
Well, we've got
right?
this kind of parody of connection through the internet, but that's not what we need. So what happened in Britain is there was a programme led by an amazing man I got to know named Dr. Sam Everington, who's a doctor. So he noticed that loads of his patients were depressed and anxious for really understandable reasons, like they were really lonely. So he decided to pioneer a different approach. One day a woman came to see him called Lisa Cunningham, who I got to know later. And he said to her, "Don't worry, I'll carry on giving you these drugs. I'm also going to prescribe something else. I'm going to prescribe for you to come twice a week to the doctor's offices here and meet with a group of other depressed and anxious people. Not to talk about how bad you feel. You can do that if you want to, that's not the point. I want you to find something meaningful you could do together." The first time the group met, Lisa literally vomited with anxiety. It was so overwhelming. But they started talking, they're like, what could they do? These are inner city East London people like me. They didn't know anything about gardening, but there was an area behind the doctor's offices that was just like scrubland. They started to turn it into a garden. They got their fingers in the soil. They started to learn the rhythms of the seasons. The way Lisa put it to me, as the garden began to bloom, we began to bloom. They started to form a tribe. They started to care about each other. If one of them didn't show up, they'd go solve each other's problems. There was a small study in Norway of a very similar program. This approach is called social prescribing. Found it was more than twice as effective as chemical antidepressants because it was dealing with some of the deep underlying reasons. Now, loneliness is not the only reason. There's a lot of reasons, but we've got to understand these are signals. Don't insult the signal. Listen to the signal. It's telling us something so important.
Neil, thank you for your question. I hope some of that information was useful for you. If this discussion does raise any difficulties for you, of course, the numbers for Lifeline, Beyond Blue and the Kids Helpline, you can see there on your screen as well. Our next question comes from Helen Waisel. Got the correct pronunciation, Helen? Waisel?
Yes, Waisel.
Waisel, thank you.
Yes. The temporary fuel excise cut is finishing in September. Many Western Sydney residents travel long distances to work. With unreliable public transport, many have no choice but to use their cars. With the rising cost of fuel, tolls, electricity, food, mortgages and rent, there is considerable pressure on families at this time. Should the government be looking at extending the fuel excise cut for another 6 to 12 months to help alleviate some of this additional burden?
The budget is coming. So what are you going to do about it?
I thought that one was coming my way.
The answer's yes, by the way, just so you know.
Hi, Helen. And I know I've actually got family members who live around the corner in Glenmore Park who I had a good chat with this afternoon. And I know that transport costs are a huge impact on people in Western Sydney. And there's a related issue, I suppose, about what we can do to create more jobs in the local region to reduce the travel times that people have to do to get to work as well. We haven't made a formal decision about that yet, but we've signalled pretty clearly that we think it's unlikely that we're going to be able to extend that fuel excise reduction beyond September.
So that's a no?
Well, we haven't formally decided, but we've been pretty clear it's unlikely, and that is because of the sheer cost. I mean, you know, you've heard us say we have inherited $1 trillion in debt. People do want to make sure that we get the budget under control. To continue extending that excise reduction is about $3 billion every 6 months, each and every year, and you're paying interest on those borrowings. So we've got to make some hard decisions about where we fund things because...
But people like Helen pay that. Helen, how much do you have to, if I can ask you, how much do you have to spend each week just on fuel, driving, commuting to work and so on?
So I actually changed my location of my my employment, so to basically alleviate some of that stress.
But at its worst, what would it cost?
Well, tolls probably anywhere from $1,000 to $1,500 a year on tolls to go to work, and then I travel somewhere between 20 to 25,000 kilometres a year for work. And that's driving backwards and forwards. So I live in the Hawkesbury. I have to drive 12 kilometres to get to the train station. Then if I want to go into the city, it's a 1 hour, 20-minute train ride. We have no express services from Richmond, so we have to sit in the trains, which are, you know, quite often cold in the winter and stinking hot in the summer. And just recently, you know, with the floods, there was no train line for many, many weeks, and it was buses replacing, so add another hour to your journey. They're just some of the things that we deal with. So we drive our cars because it's an hour and 10 minutes in the car into the city rather than,
and then you're filling up
2 hours.
you're filling up a couple of times a week.
Correct.
It's a common story.
And
when
also
we've
with
spoken to
tradies
people
as
in
well.
other parts as well.
Tradies spend about $5,000 a year in tolls, right? Wow. And they've got fuel, and the fuel's going up. And can we all remember what tradies do? They build everything that we need, okay? And a lot of people just look down on them. You know, when the lockdowns happened, they kind of dismissed the workers. And right now, they're paying tolls, they've got the fuels. It's an absolute rip-off for anyone living in Western Sydney. Again, another one, election time, Western Sydney. And now they're paying pretty much 3 times the amount of anyone else. And yes, it's nice to have jobs in the area, but those jobs have got to turn up first, and then we've got to get those jobs. And that might be a year away, and someone could literally lose their home. And often, you know, people say, oh, what's $5,000? You know what? That's a lot of money to a lot of people. And I think we need to go back down to the everyday person and say to them, what can we do? Look at a family and say, how can we help you? And take their word for it, not listen to, you know, someone in an office in the city, a policy advisor saying this is what they need. Ask them what they need, and then put a policy together that's actually going to work and keep them afloat.
Okay. Let's get to our next question from Amy Bell. Amy?
Hi, my question's for you, Blak Douglas. You're very political, and you have already demonstrated that you're maintaining that politicalness here tonight. But my question for you is, has the Archibald restricted you or made you feel more freedom to maintain that political platform?
It's landed me a spot on Q&A, hasn't it? Which I must thank my publicist for. Look, it's been a rollercoaster ride of emotions, the whole thing. The credit, I can't emphasise enough, the credit needs to be given to the trustees at the Art Gallery of New South Wales for taking the opportune moment to choose such an image. That painting has very proudly become a flagship of Lismore.
Let's tell people about that for people who are unfamiliar. It's about a flood survivor.
Yeah, so it features Carla Dickens, who is a dear friend of mine, a celebrated Wiradjuri female artist, and she's in Ganella Bar up in Lismore, so watching and also harbouring families that were in need of care during that time. It couldn't have been more topical to paint such an image and to have that image celebrated. So it's so much credit owed there. But in terms of, it has given a glimpse of hope of how art can be a powerful conveyor of political commentary.
I was going to ask you about that. What's the role of an artist in this time? Listen to the conversation we've had tonight. Trust, truth, accountability, loneliness, people uncertain. What do you look for as an artist when you're trying to speak to that and also make a political statement, as you say?
Well, we're of a certain ilk that is a bit of a rarity and a bit of a kind of a pushing a boulder up a hill in terms of urban political artists. Basically, respectively, Carla and I make works about the effects of colonisation on First Nations people. So it's an honour to be able to have that art celebrated in Australia rather than how foreign countries treat their politicised artists. So I'm very thankful for that. And so my responsibility is to send those subtle reminders out to the community, just to remind for those who claim that we are the greatest country on the planet, we've got a little bit of work to do.
Stan,
Yeah.
can I just confirm that was so uplifting for Lismore and the Northern Rivers community when the Archibald Prize was given, and I thank you so much for choosing that. It does bring people together, which comes back again to what you said earlier, that we need to come together in a disaster. And we had, that wonderful music festival where all those bands volunteered and it brought Lismore together. Poured with rain, of course, but the joy at that festival, it was so uplifting. So know what a difference you've made to ordinary people. Everyone's very grateful.
Thank you.
It's boy, this show's gone so fast tonight. There's been so many great stories and a great chance to hear from you. We've come to our final question, and it's from Jack Heath. Jack?
Thanks, Stan. At a time of diminishing trust in national institutions, of which we've heard today, we also have less people making donations, less people volunteering. So the question is, how do we rebuild community trust? Can we do that online? Or does it need to be face-to-face, as the result of the recent federal elections would seem to suggest? In short, is it a case that digital builds connection, but that it is face-to-face that builds trust?
Well, speaking about trust, Keith, how do you rebuild trust?
Oh, I think you continue to talk to people and connect with them. I'm a big supporter of getting rid of anonymous and fake accounts online. I think it's detrimental to our society. I don't think it needs to exist. And I think it's really damaging for our kids. That was something that we were looking to progress when we were in government, and I'm hopeful the Labor government picks that up. And I just want to make two other quick points. I know you're coming to the end of the show. First one is a shout out to our veterans, Vietnam Veterans Day today, all of our veterans and service personnel. Just previously on your cost of living question, that is the question. It is the question right now, right across the country. And I just want to see the Albanese government refocus on that because, mate, I had an interview during the week. I talk about the cost of electricity to cook a steak and I got hammered with responses because people are cooking party pies and fish fingers because that's what they can afford.
Yeah. Johann, the question of, you mentioned it before, loneliness. We are so connected, and of course we got so used to, the various online connections we had to resort to during COVID. How do we rebuild trust in a world where we have to wear masks for our health safety, where sometimes we're locked down and separated from family, where we meet online and we can't meet in person? What's this done to us as a society?
Yeah, if your question is so important, if online connections met our deeper needs as psychological needs as human beings, we would all have been completely fine in the last 2 years. Instead, I didn't ever hear one person say the words, hooray, another Zoom call. Never, not once. No one will ever say that word, right? That sentence, right? So you're absolutely right. We've got to actually connect with our deeper needs. It made me think about, for my book, Stolen Focus, Why You Can't Pay Attention, I went to the first ever internet rehab centre in the world. It's in Spokane in Washington. And they get all kinds of people there, but they disproportionately get young men who become obsessed with online role-player games or pornography, right? And it was so interesting talking to them and afterwards reflecting on this with Dr. Hilary Cash, the amazing woman who runs the centre, and realising, in a way, I think the connection between social media and social life is a bit like the relationship between pornography and sex, right? I don't think it's a coincidence they're obsessed with both. I think, in a way, I'm not anti-porn, but if your whole sex life consisted of looking at porn, you'd be kind of pissed off all the time, because that's not what we evolved for, right? We evolved to have sex. In a similar way, we didn't evolve to interact all the time through screens. We evolved to do what we're doing, right? We know that. We know that. We've felt the pain of it. So we need to listen to the pain of the last 2 years. It'll teach us something really important, and we need to reconnect online, partly, and then reconnect offline. And there's loads of evidence about how we can do that, and the benefits. We'll be less depressed, our attention will be better, we'll be less anxious. Not only can we do it, we have to do it, because the alternative is depression, anxiety, and attention problems will continue to rise.
Johann started with herpes and he's finished with porn. I don't know what he's trying to tell us. I don't know what he's trying to tell us tonight. Dear, oh dear. This is an 8:30 program.
Remember, to simplify with trust, trust is built when your actions match your words.
Kathy?
Trust?
Trust?
It's leadership. as you say, actions need to match words, but this needs to come from the top. We've had behaviours in Donald Trump, in the UK with Boris Johnson, and I mean, I'm feeling here in Australia, and the breach in trust is devastating. I think we need to do something about what's going on up in the top.
Blak.
I was just going to say that let's also be reminded that for a good part of that period up in Lismore, there was no online services. So the possibility of the peoples in desperation seeking trust via a digital service was not happening. Rather, where it did happen and where the camaraderie was built was by the incredible efforts of Koori Mail, down on the ground, who are still on the ground.
Aboriginal newspaper.
The only Aboriginal newspaper who became the mecca for the community for services required.
And did you feel that had like a different quality to it than if it had just been all happening on the internet?
Any time you sit around a campfire or you sit with other people in a similar situation and chow down, it's a great place, a great breeding ground for trust and camaraderie.
I would go to Murray, but he's had a lot to say tonight, and he's got 3 years in government.
I can give you
to
three
try
words.
to hold or rebuild
3 words.
your trust.
Trust equals
It's too long.
honesty and respect.
Okay.
That's as simple as that.
That's all we have time for tonight. Please thanks our panel, Johann Hari, Catherine Cusack, Murray Watt, Blak Douglas, Amanda Rose, and Keith Pitt. Thank you, Keith, for coming to us from remote. Thanks to those of you here and at home as well for sharing your questions. Next week, we're live from Melbourne. We're going to be discussing ethics in sport. How do we balance fairness and inclusion in Australian sport today? Joining me on that panel, Olympic champion Kieran Perkins, handball player Hannah Mounsey, former NRL player Joe Williams, Pacific sport consultant David Lakisa, and sports lawyer Catherine Ordway. Do go to our website. You can register to be in the audience there. Now, something really special to leave you with. We're going to leave you with some wise words from local legend Uncle Wes Marne. Now, Uncle Wes, at 100 years of age, has just published his first book of poetry. Uncle Wes, how are you?
I'm good, thanks.
I was given the honour of being there to launch that book. It was a really special day, Uncle. Now, you're going to leave us with a poem that I believe was inspired by Paul Keating's Redfern Address. What's the name of the poem?
Indigenous Ones.
Take it away.
Can you tell them what Paul Keating said?
I won't go into it all, but Paul Keating essentially said that for the first time from a Prime Minister that Australians were the ones, white Australians were the ones who took the children, who stole the land, who created so much of the misery that First Nations people still live with, didn't he, Uncle Wes? And committed that day to being responsible, to commit to reconciliation and to change that. Take it away with your poem.
Right. Indigenous people of this earth's land, now's the time for us all to join hands, to let the world know that we're still here. Let's do it now, for this is our year. Let the world know that our culture's alive. Let them all know that we have survived. And we'll let them all know that we are still strong. And we'll let them all know that we are not wrong. And while there's one to tell stories, and there's one to hear, while we still do our dances, they'll know we're still here. While we still sing our songs, and still hunt our land, no one can take that culture from our hand. So let the old ones tell the story, and let the young ones hear and learn. Tell them of our days of glory, so that for more they will yearn. And they will teach their young ones, and teach them what we were told. And we will be here forever, and our culture will never grow old.
Uncle Wes Marne.